This podcast is brought to you by Humans, the next generation HRIS supporting distributed organizations globally.
Okay, Libby, excited to have you around. How are you doing today?
Good. Pleased that we could finally make this happen.
Fantastic. So I have Libby Penn with me today, former COO at Improbable. I'm massively delighted to have you around, and I was really looking forward to the conversation. We touched on a few topics earlier that can be, pretty special. So thanks very much for taking the time.
My pleasure. We
can jump straight with your story, perhaps, to contextualize a little bit, what you do and a little bit of your adventures in the building businesses and scale up startup space. So we'd love to know more about, again, what you've been up to and, where you're coming from and your journey.
Perfect. So COO by trade, which really the best description of it has been to me a Swiss Army knife. Somebody who can tackle and solve a variety of problems in a variety of fields. And a particular passion area for me within that is obviously HR and people and culture, which I think was why we connected so well. And most recently, I've been doing that at Improbable, where I helped grow their defence business, building out digital twins, servicing Ministry of Defence, Department of Defence, NATO, etc. And really, we had the opportunity to blitzscale that business, took it from sort of 40 heads initially up to pushing towards 400 UK, US, and then restructured that business and eventually sold it. So, a big part of building a company like that is building a strong culture, one that's really focused on performance, accountability, driven by values, particularly important in a space like defence. So I think that's probably why I'm here and talking to you today.
Fantastic. I mean, the role of a COO is fascinating because what I've seen is there is no a specific background. Different people are coming, can be from kind of a business perspective, commercial perspective. Some people can be more HR as well. What's your view in general? What is the COO at a company that has been shaping up, scaling, and are there specific aspects of the company building that the CEO should be, looking after?
Yeah, great question and a really interesting one. There's a fantastic article in the Harvard Business Review called The 7 Types of COO for exactly that reason, in that we often have very varied backgrounds. Mine was originally business development at the beginning of my career, and then when I joined a startup, my job was just grow it and fill the gaps, and that was everything from sales and driving growth through to building out a customer success team, supporting project management, customer implementation, and then looking at the broader gaps that were needed as a business scaled, so HR, finance, operations. And so, personally, I've lost that T shape that you get as a leader. My vertical used to be sales. I would now say I'm much more breadth focused, but I'm personally very, very interested in HR and the sort of people culture piece around building high performance teams. But it is interesting. I've worked with COOs who've come from finance backgrounds. I know you had Alice on. She came from CarWow, who had a legal background. But ultimately, I think we are fixers. So I think it's a mindset profile. And as I say, when I was at Spectrix, the sort of first proper startup I did, the reason I grew into that COO role was because I was the person who plugged the gaps, and partnering with technical founders, as we often meet them of that profile in startups. My job was sort of everything that wasn't technology, and so it really gives you that opportunity to sort of reach into the different gaps in the business and unify those sort of cross-functional teams.
You mentioned that the people component is a very key aspects of the role there, and you touched earlier on building high-performing team. Maybe we can start there.
Yeah.
What's your view on how you build actually high performing team in the context of an organization that is designed to scale at a pretty substantial pace?
Yeah, it's one that we debate hotly. And, I think anybody who's worked in their lives or sort of competed in sports, when you feel that a team is high performing, and when you feel that it isn't. And we have this ambition to build organizations where we are consistently high performance, i.e. we are accountable, we deliver outputs predictably, consistently, and often exceeding expectations. But actually, we also know from reality that sometimes we're not high performing teams. 1 week you could be having a fantastic week and it could feel like the entire team are pulling in the same direction. And other weeks you can just feel like nobody's on the same page and getting it right. And I think there's a sort of human fallibility element to that. And certainly, when I've been building businesses and somewhere like Improbable Defense, where, the early days we were finding product market fit, you definitely had those highs and lows of feeling that everybody was unified and, we had a clear product vision, everybody knew the strategic priorities. And then 2 weeks later, for whatever reason, you suddenly don't feel quite so connected. And, part of the COO's job is just to try and create that cohesion and that unity. But
why do you think they happened? Why you felt there was, again, some level of disconnect?
I think the challenge is things change so much in growing businesses. So when, if I think back to the Improbable example, a new customer contract opportunity might emerge that didn't necessarily fit with what we'd been talking about 2 weeks ago. So, naturally, entrepreneur-led businesses, you are willing to adapt and take on new opportunities. And so I think, the example I'm thinking of was we certainly all committed to going, hey, this is the product market fit we believe we're after. This means we're after this product pipeline. Great, our sales pipeline, we're comfortable with that. But then what happens was, you get a left of field contract opportunity coming in that doesn't quite feel like it fits, but you can see why you might go after it. Your CEO is a sort of sales-led leader, as we had at Improbable, amazing salesman. And he was like, look, we can make this work. And that's absolutely the right thing to do for growing businesses, where you do have to be entrepreneurial, you do have to flex your strategy. But actually for teams, often they want to know what they're doing and they want to be able to follow through on that. And so that sort of ambiguity, I think, that comes with startups can be quite unsettling for people. So I think in that example, 1 week you have a clear strategy and it's X and everyone's going after that. And then the week after, well, actually there's a curveball coming in and suddenly we all have to sort of slightly change tack. And that's a really hard nuance, I think, for teams to deal with. And people have a wobble and suddenly you're a bit disconnected. People sometimes feel frustrated because they feel like we had a strategy and it's changed. But I think this leads me to a point that one of the most critical facets of high-performing teams in startups is that ability to manage ambiguity. Mm-hmm. And it was absolutely something that we really doubled on interviewing for our candidates coming into the business to go, this is a startup growing into a scale-up. Things will change. There will be curveballs. There will be changes of direction, of strategy, as we find our feet and we grow, and there'll be fits and starts of growth, of teams expanding, contracting, whilst we kind of find our way. How do you cope with that? And, to me, the best people I've worked with are the people who can cope with that ambiguity and actually kind of thrive on it in this operating context.
Do you think you can assess clearly that in an interview process? Because sometimes people say, of course I can adjust to change, I'm flexible, but then in reality they don't really get what level of ambiguity they are, walking into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really hard. You can never totally get the truth through an interview process, and that's why, I'm also comfortable that not all hires work out, because there's only so much you can test for. But I think, asking questions, obviously always example-based through the interview, and actually asking people, when has something changed and it's really frustrated you and what did you do about it? So that you're sort of leading them in the wrong direction of going, okay, talk to me about when change has annoyed you, talk to me about how you've got people back on the straight and narrow. And normally those examples really start to tease out whether people go, actually, I worked, as part of the team to adapt our strategy, versus people who respond with examples where they've tried to be very rigid and sort of reinforce teams back onto the original path without perhaps considering the business drivers there. So that's the sort of stuff I'd always be really teasing for through interview.
And going back to the performance component, how do you measure performance? Because again, is another gray area where perhaps in sales can be a little bit straightforward. There is a component of numbers. Are you hitting your numbers? Yes or no? Pipeline, are you generating the level of volume that you need? But is that sufficient to assess if you actually are driving the level of resources you want, and how you also measure kind of broader as a business and not specifically in a function that
this was something we spent a bit of time playing around with, because it is a bit of a dark art, I think, sort of metrics-based performance management. One of the things that we rolled out was a scorecard of hard skills, soft skills, and alignment with the values and behaviours we wanted as a business. And we had to really play around with kind of getting the nuance of that. And the way to make that work, in my experience, is to build a sort of review panel. And it feels quite onerous. And so that's probably the tough side of it, is actually you've got a number of people talking about performance and progress of teams, looking at scorecards collectively so that you're overcoming any management bias. Mm-hmm. But we built, say, here, list out the values of the business. This is quite an easy one. I think lots of people do it. 1 to 4 excellent, 1, significant room for improvement. Then looking at the key softer skills relevant to that role, and often, that would vary whether it was an individual contributor role, or whether it was a management role, whether it was heavily embedded in a team, and that may be collaboration, communication, ability to cope with change as well. And then you're looking at the sort of harder skills related to that role, whether that's C++ or whether that's, project management, timeline definition, depending on the role. And actually, by building out that kind of framework, also what it did was it gave us a clear path to go back to people to say, kind of here's where you're ranking, and if you want to progress and get further sort of remuneration or promotion, here are the key areas we need you to improve. And it just gave us a lot more specificity in terms of feedback to employees as well, and really just kept us honest in terms of defining the expectations of what an effective team in that context would be, because each team and operating environment is slightly different. A high performance engineering team works a little bit differently to perhaps a high-performance sales team.
Amazing. And let's say you manage to identify strong talents, they're actually performing at the level that you expect or exceeding expectations ideally. How do you make sure that you keep the density of talent as you grow the business as well?
Oh, the hardest thing. And honestly, I remember extensive debates with our leadership and talent team around, we were sort of pushing, as I say, we hit about 70 heads and we were gunning to be 200 as fast as possible. That's a big ask on your talent team, and particularly when, it's a really competitive environment recruiting software engineers. And so we had the debate around, do you lower the bar and accept that churn will happen within the organization, so that you lower the talent bar coming in and allow people to prove themselves, and if not, the probation fail rate goes up? Or do you maintain the sort of maximum velocity you can, which may not be as fast as you want in terms of managing a really high bar of talent coming into the business? And so the question is, do you take the risk of diluting talent density and allow probation processes to kind of weed out talent there? Or do you double down on maintaining a high bar coming into the business? We went with the latter. We, Improbable did amazingly well at really putting people through their paces for interviews, and that really showed in our pass rate of probation. And then once people are in, and particularly as you scale, you really need to think about how are you setting those people up for success. So how do you double down on knowledge transfer so that people actually have the skills and content and context to do the job? But also, how do you set up forums whereby when you're so focused on delivery, you're actually also giving people a chance to upskill as they go? And I think that that's probably, to me, one of the hardest things in scale-ups is you've got a pressure target of growth. And we really found this at Improbable. You know, we were winning contracts, we had to deliver against them. You have sprint deadlines, you've got customers saying, you know, you've got a contract, you've got to ship by this date. But at the same time, you really want to support talent development within your team, but that takes them away from the immediate day-to-day work. And I think that was one of the hardest balances, and one we, you know, in all honesty, we didn't get right. And I think you have to bake that talent development strategy into your organization from the outset and not as an afterthought. Because as an afterthought, it means that it's too late. You're already on the treadmill of customer delivery, of product delivery, and you can't really factor in the time and space for it. Whereas other startups that I've advised much earlier, you know, they've started to go, we have a genuine commitment around improving our talent density, around supporting talent development, whether that's through training, learning and development, conferences, mentoring opportunities. And in doing that from day one, actually then it's already factored into your time and effort when you go out and you start pitching customer work. Whereas if it becomes a bit more of an afterthought, which really, you know, for us it was, because we're so focused on delivery, it becomes really difficult to sort of then shoehorn that back in without going, oh God, are we going to compromise customers in this situation?
Are you also comfortable with the fact that if talent density is high and you're growing fast, so you don't have enough time to, you know, focus on some aspects that can be helpful for the talent, you're going to have a higher level of attrition? And if you have higher level of attrition, how do you approach that? Would you be comfortable with having higher attrition, so you hire more people and say, okay, tenure is going to be shorter, is tech is extremely competitive, or do you try and have some level of strategy to mitigate the risk?
I think it has to be the latter. I mean, attrition is expensive. And particularly, I think, working in defence, where you're often putting people through security clearance, the upfront investment to get people ramped up onto projects is much more time consuming. But also when you are working in deep tech, as we were, it's also this piece around, you know, it takes a little bit of time to learn the product and get up to speed with it. And so I think you really need to double down on how do you engage the talent that you have successfully. And that's not just learning and development, it's culture, it's role modeling the values of the business, but also healthy values, what it is to work in tech. And I think we all fall into that trap of we're sprinting a marathon and we actually need to pace set a little bit more. And in doing that, creating an environment that's much more sustainable long-term for people, because I think part of why we often see that sort of significant attrition piece is people just burn out, and they don't, because they're being pushed for sort of constant deadline delivery, they don't feel valued in the same way. And so if you create an environment that's a little more nurturing, a little more understanding, that people have to have work-life balance, that you can't just keep sprinting for quarters or years on end, that also goes quite a long way to retaining your staff.
And you would think about phases of sprints, let's say, you know, okay, we can go through a phase that is, I don't know, like, you know, the 12 months, 18 months mark, and then you kind of, you know, enter, and you are familiar with the fact, again, you might have some turnover that is related to those phases as well. Yeah,
I think it is really a real challenge, because you obviously have teams pushing towards product launches or major customer contract milestones. So as you say, that's not a 2-week sprint or a 2-month sprint. You're talking much more long-term sustained. And you do naturally end up having people go, okay, I've delivered that project and I think I'm done here. But what you should be really thinking about doing is what next for them. So first, to my earlier point, you need to find a better rhythm of long-term project delivery so that you're not burning people out and they're not hitting a point of going, okay, we've delivered that customer contract. It's time for me to look for my next job because I need a break, and a new job often feels like a break, right? And instead, make sure your delivery methodologies give people time and space. And then after that, and it is about giving people the chance to have rotations, to have career secondments, to have that opportunity to go, okay, I will now support you with a month of downtime for experimentation. I'm sure many people listening to the podcast have all had teams come to them going, well, but what about 20% time or even 10% time for R&D? Let me be creative. I can move the business forward. And, lots of great ideas come out of that time. But again, it's very hard to bake that time in when you have investors who are going, okay, but you should be delivering more contracts, and you have customers who are waiting for their deliverables. And so actually, instead of trying to approach that by being sort of ingrained into a sustained rhythm, another way is baking that in at the end of major project milestones is, okay, now you get a bit of a break to go and experiment on X or Y rather than rolling on to the next hard project. But I think the biggest thing to me is teams have to trust that leadership have their back. And when they feel that isn't there, that's when you've got that real risk of churn. If they feel that they're not valued, or that you're just paying lip service to the fact that, it's just one last crunch and after that it's going to be easier. I think you have to get to a point where they trust that you will deliver on your promises and that you are being honest with them. And sometimes that honest message, to your point, is this is going to be 18 months of a really hard slog, but we will reward you for that in whatever appropriate way that motivates you.
What's your way on the stage fit as well? Because you mentioned scaling a company from 40 people to 400. You have two entirely different organizations. So I might be the type of person that is loving the sprints, is loving the hard work, whatever the brutality that is related to that. But then I'm not going to enjoy, but I'm going to enjoy that in a context of a 40 people organization. I'm not necessarily going to enjoy in the context of a 400 people where there is more bureaucracy, there is more process, there is more, I need to kind of, document things in a certain way. If not, people are not going to be whatever. I hate that. I just want to get stuff done and move on into the next thing and smash the next target and goal. How do you think about that?
Improbable was such an interesting journey for that, because we were servicing defense. The role that our security team and actually their relationship with people in HR had to play in that space was you're effectively a regulated business, but people don't think of it like that. Because you're dealing with classified information, because your team have to have clearances, because your facilities have to be, able to handle classified content. Actually, what happens is you end up having to bring in these processes to an organization much earlier than perhaps another one would. So you say, 400 person organization, you think of all the process and paperwork. Actually, when we were a 70 person organization, we were having to start to bring in process and paperwork, which was both a blessing because it does start to force the organization to mature and get their head around the fact that structure does need to come into place and take it seriously, and it sort of familiarizes them by leading the way. But then it is also really challenging because you can't move as fast as people would feel that would be appropriate for a sort of startup transitioning to that scale up phase. So Improbable was such a unique beast because the role that security had to play in terms of literally physically locking down rooms and access controls and document management and the process and check-ins we had to put with some of our team who had higher level of clearance. So we were forced to mature a bit more quickly, but I do think it is a real challenge, and a lesson I had to learn much earlier on in my career is it's not only what got you here won't necessarily get you there, but sometimes it's who got you here won't get you there. And, I've had to exit quite a senior person quite early on in my career. And it was sort of heartbreaking because he'd been in the business since early days, very critical technology leader. But when put into an environment where there were 120 plus people, of which 50% were engineers, he wasn't a repeatable leader. He really was a very smart individual contributor that was a bit of a visionary that the earlier stage engineers wanted to follow. But in the context of having, 50 or 60 engineers in his team, he wasn't able to support a bit more process and structure or engage with career development plans, career ladders, etc. And it's such a bitter pill to swallow, having to sort of help people leave the business at times. And sometimes you can move them into individual contributor roles without management responsibility and keep that connection. And at other times, actually, it's just too much water under the bridge and they don't
Is
work.
there something that in the context you managed to spot early and then try and create a plan that made sense, or you kind of realize when actually you had to take some sort of drastic action because things were going quite quickly?
It was a really interesting one because emotionally you could see what was happening. The leader looked burnt out, really fried. Ultimately, he looked tired. He was coming in later and later. He was snappy with the team. The team were getting frustrated. They were raising concerns about him, but also concerns for themselves and the team performance. But the broader leadership team, had this real worry around how do you exit someone who's senior. Maybe we just need to help them be part-time and just put a bit of padding around them and hire them.
What's obviously the impact on who's staying and how they're going to perceive, and perceive the news or whatever.
And so ultimately, in that situation, I think everyone was sort of just hoping it would work out by just giving that individual a bit more time and space. But it didn't. And actually, it sort of made it worse to the point that we then had to sort of have a rip the Band-Aid off moment, and that exit had to be a bit faster. And there is no right or wrong way because every situation is ultimately different. But I think what it taught me is you have to do what's best for the business first and foremost, whilst balancing that respectfully for your employees and doing the right thing by them. But we are running a business. We have shareholders and customers we have to service, as well as employees who are, the third group of stakeholders you have to manage. And it's not being cruel to be kind, but it's the same concept, which is actually sometimes you just have to have a really uncomfortable direct conversation and go, your contribution has been massive getting us here. Yeah. And you're so valued and so appreciated. But in the current role, this no longer works. What the business needs is something different, something with, in this context, broader management skills, who's worked at that scale. Let's have a conversation as to whether there is another role for you within the business or whether that needs to be a path out of the business. And then let's do that in quite a time-constrained way, because dragging these things out, hugely stressful. Yeah. It's so stressful. And, I've had to leave a business before, and it's really emotional because you've put so much time and effort in, and you recognize that maybe you're no longer the right person in that context, but you wish you could be because you've been there so long and you feel that you've really contributed to that space. So firsthand, I've learned earlier in my career that actually it's really hard when you're no longer the right person for it. So it needs to get dealt with much more quickly, to be kind to that employee as much as to do what's right for the business.
You mentioned the people component, but also you mentioned the shareholder value component, and expectations maybe around aggressive growth and whatever outcome that we design for the company or we align with the company from day one. How do you align the two things?
Oh, I wish I had a silver bullet for that one. It's super interesting. And what I've seen time and time again is startups are often highly mission-led. And so you build these teams that are so behind what you're doing and so passionate about it. And those early stage teams, it's often about going the extra mile, right? About finding that product market fit, around pleasing that first customer so that you retain them, around making sure the product's right for that second, third, fourth, fifth customer, because they want to deliver against a mission, which nearly always has the customer at the heart of it. But as you scale, and particularly once you close that Series A round, you have shareholders who want to see revenue growth. And revenue growth ultimately drives your ability to deliver your mission. But what I've seen time and time again, you know, I saw it at Improbable, we were very committed to the defense mission. But as soon as we started to go, oh, we've got traction, let's think more about pushing this pipeline of revenue harder, the team almost has an allergic reaction, because in their mind, commercial growth is in direct opposition to mission delivery and being a values-based organization. And actually, I think our job as leaders in the C-suite is to help the organization reconcile being values-led, mission-led with commercial acumen. And to me, that's about teaching the organization and every single individual in it the basics of how we make money and what that does for our organization. And, you know, understanding a P&L is not something I knew when I was a 24-year-old, you know, in the first couple of years of my career. And why would, you know, an entry-level software engineer understand that? Why would they think, you know, the pressure of a commercial pipeline, you know, is good for the business? Why do they think that? Because to them, that's putting the pressure on product delivery that may well compromise the quality of the product. And so actually you need to teach them that it provides stability for the organization. You know, we all have the valleys of death to cross in startups. So if we don't secure revenue, we're not going to be here. So we can't continue to build the product. But also, the more successful we are, the more we can invest in our people and our product to deliver against that mission in a way that we are all values aligned, and where we can invest in learning and development, because money is what pays for this. Businesses are a trade-off of opportunity cost constantly. And so my preference, and you know, I did this at Spectrix, was to work with the finance leader to build out a program to teach the organization to understand opportunity cost. And then they start to understand the pressures of the business and the opportunities of it. They start to make better decisions as well, because it is a trade-off. I'll never forget being in another organization that had announced a big funding round. And my inbox was literally flooded with people going, can we have new laptops? Can we have a new fridge full of snacks? Can we? And it was like just this wish list from people. And I was like, guys, let me take you through the fundraising deck. Part of this was convertible loan note, so it's not real money anyway, right? But the rest of that money was about driving growth. It was about making key hires. It was about entering a new market. It was about, you know, product development. It wasn't about new laptop upgrades, offices with nicer views, you know, oat milk in the fridge. The investors put their money in for a specific reason. And so, but why would they know that? And so I think the big lesson I've learned through those sort of micro moments in my career is, you know, we're often, as leaders, get frustrated with people coming to us going, but I want more for less. But why not? And, you know, A, that's not the worst ask in the world, but B, do they have the context around that ask? And often, no, they don't. So it's our job as leaders to provide that context. Which
and also iterate with communication, because you get new people coming in, they don't have the context, and then you need to kind of, you know, re-educate as well. Totally. And so that's our job, right? We have to role model and we have to provide the context to the business. On a different note, you build in defense, which is a fascinating sector and space with a unique set of challenges. Maybe we can touch a little bit on that. What does it mean building in defense?
So I'd never worked in defense before I came to Improbable. So it was, shall we say, an absolute baptism of fire. And because the second you win a government contract in this space, the majority of those contracts require you to handle classified data. And so that means that you have to get your people cleared, your facilities cleared. It means you have to put in a whole host of process and protocol. And that isn't just about hiring a security officer to manage that. It's about building a culture that is a secure first mindset. And that really is an incredible learning curve, I think, because most people who've worked in startups, you're quite free with how you work, right? You can use whatever plugins or tools you want in the early days, although you shouldn't. Let's be slightly smarter on our prioritization and selection of that. But, you're not really thinking about where data is living, who can access documents. You're not really thinking about whether you can take your laptop to certain countries or not. And so suddenly we were faced with going, okay, well, we've won contracts. We've got to take this really pretty seriously now. And, the big lesson learned for me was that security isn't just about your security team. It's obviously about everyone. But the critical relationship is actually between security and your people and talent teams, because you're dealing with people who have clearances, and the sort of malicious actor profiles that, you have to be worried about are your own people feeling frustrated at an organisation and taking sensitive information out, or them being approached because they might have a personal vulnerability, and that could be exploited. And so it really translated the lens of what it meant to keep an eye on your staff, because actually suddenly pastoral care was really critical to us. If people did look deeply frustrated at the organisation, or they were having a really tough time, or their mortgage application had fallen through for some reason, actually these are all sorts of things that it was quite important contextually for us to be aware of and to support them through, because we have employees that if they're pissed off, could actually then become a threat, and in this case, potentially a national threat. So that relationship that security had to have with our people and talent teams, in terms of screening who was coming in terms of monitoring how people were feeling about the organisation, the sort of stress levels, the broader sentiment, the employee engagement data, suddenly became this huge sort of critical piece of how we ran the business, which previously security had been a bit of an afterthought in other organizations, and for us it became the lifeblood, integrated into our sort of people and culture strategy.
I mean, everything starts with hiring. How do you think about hiring in the context compared to a traditional SaaS business?
You obviously have additional limitations because you have nationality restrictions, which can be challenging if people have to get different levels of clearance. But for us, one of the harder things was people sort of come to you because they're interested in what the business is doing, and defense and games tech, it sounds interesting. It sounds like a complicated challenge that people wanted to get their teeth into. But the hard thing through the interview process was trying to impress upon people the reality of the supply chain that we were part of. And I remember when I was being interviewed for it, we talked about something called the sort of kill command chain. And I was like, it hadn't really truly dawned on me that, of course, defense is part of global conflicts, and you are part of that supply chain, and there will be political decisions that are outside of your control but that you have to service. We were at the behest of, at the time, initially Her Majesty's government, and then more recently His Majesty's government, and our contracts may tie us to political international agendas that people may not feel aligned to. And, I won't ever forget that when one of the, probably 4 years ago now, the sort of Israeli-Palestinian conflict was back on the headlines again. And suddenly one of my employees came to me and said, actually, don't we work with one of the Israeli weapons suppliers? And I said, well, distantly down the supply chain we're part of, yes, they're part of that. And that employee said, no, I can't work in an organisation involved in that kind of conflict, and resigned. And I had a huge amount of respect for them because they made a clear choice. But it's incredibly hard to sort of impress upon people through the interview process the enormous global complexity of what we're doing and how broad that supply chain is, and where we may be just doing one tiny piece of data engineering over here. Actually, that piece of data is feeding, a conflict strategy over here, which is much broader and of course has political affiliations to it. And so it's really difficult to get people to think that through. And we'd often spend quite a long time at multiple parts of the interview process, from screening to a final fit. We would always do a final fit interview with myself or the CEO or CTO of the business. And a big part of that agenda was just talking through the broader reality of working in defence and what that meant, and trying to get people to sort of go away and think about it. And think about, if you're at a dinner party and, somebody challenges you around your position around servicing defence, how do you respond? How do you feel about that? Because it isn't for everyone, and you do kind of have to flush that out, because I think people get sort of carried away with the sort of idealistic idea of solving complicated national security problems without necessarily thinking about the day-to-day applications of that.
And as you were building kind of more of a global team, you noticed also differences across, again, Europe, US, in the way you actually, having those conversations and attract people?
It's interesting. The US is broadly much more patriotic. And I don't think it's unfair to say that the candidates coming into US business generally felt more defence of a mindset. They were much more prepared for what they were signing up for. And maybe because the brand of Improbable Defence was much more defence oriented in the US, and in the UK we still had the big games company behind us. And so I think we attracted a lot of talent that was sort of coming towards the games business and going, well, it's just like creating a shoot 'em up and like slightly different, shall we say. And so actually in the US, it was less of an agenda point. Although interestingly, UK-US defence businesses, for anyone who's in the difficult challenge of expanding a UK business into the US, where there may be a dual application into defence, is you have to put different restrictions in place whereby we couldn't really interview people. Our US leadership had to, because they have a concern around sort of foreign control or influence of non-US entities in an environment where we might be able to in turn exploit that employee because we might have learned something confidential about them through the interview process. So really interesting arm's length relationship with the US, which could at times be a little frustrating. But yeah, more broadly from the US interactions, much more patriotic, much more at grips with the concept of defence and the role that the US had to play in it. UK, it was much newer territory for a lot of the team.
More broadly, given that we're touching on the US, Europe component, you've been working across both countries for quite a bit, and you've seen companies growing perhaps at a different pace, or there is maybe an element of optimism that is a little bit stronger in the US, let's say. Maybe there is a cultural component. Maybe you tell me what's your view there. But is any observation around kind of the candidate aspects, the talent aspects, but also why companies are growing at a different pace there, and there is this element of, yes, we're going to do it, and we're going to do faster and better?
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it, how the US has broadly culturally a very different mindset. It feels more aspirational, and I think that is a cultural mindset, and you do feel it when you interact with UK versus US teams. And Brits are often slightly more introverted, find conflict harder to deal with, I think. Generalizations, of course, not everyone's like this. Whereas in the US, actually, people are a bit more frank, a bit more direct, and a bit more optimistic. And so I think there is a sort of cultural element at play there. And I think that's tied to the US history and its narrative around, the streets could be paved with gold if you want them to be. And I think that does translate more broadly into industry. And of course, the pots of money, because of the scale of the market, are bigger, and the talent pool is bigger, and everything is bigger. And so I think people find that the opportunity seems grander over there, and I think it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy financially if we look at the venture capital funds and their position over there. Of course, not to build a political agenda here, but Brexit has massively impacted the UK's position on building startups. Many businesses I know are looking to jump ship for their Series A or Series B over to the US because it feels that they're more supported and the opportunity is greater there. And, you only need to look at the sort of European fund deal flows to see actually the majority of that's now in Europe, not in the UK. Most of those fund partners are looking at Germany, they're looking at Paris, they're looking at the Nordics. And so the entire climate has changed. And I think, since Brexit, the tech culture mindset has taken a bit of a beating over here. People have felt very frustrated around the opportunities available to us and the implications of that, and a whole host of political leadership changes that have impacted the agenda for entrepreneurs here. And so the US in many ways has doubled down on the entrepreneurial vision. Trump, whether you like him or hate him, but he absolutely represents that idea of the self-made billionaire, and that sets a tempo, doesn't it? So it is fascinating how much is sort of cultural dynamic, how much is crafted by politics, but I definitely see that it is different growing businesses in the US. People are a bit more pro-risk and pro-opportunity with that.
When you think about your role specifically, there is a component around educating a founder, an entrepreneur around those important decisions. So if we having a conversation and say, okay, we believe that we want to expand to the US because of these reasons that you just described, there is an opportunity there, we can go faster. But maybe there is a question around timing. Is this the right moment to do that, yes or no? How do you think about helping founders understand what are the right calls, how you make these evaluations, kind of more strategic decision making? What's the role of a CEO, kind of more broadly into this?
Well, so there's sort of two questions at play there. So the guidance around international expansion, I think, is the first one. And I think the best advice I have for CEOs trying to lead that is to talk to as many CEOs who've paved that way before, because I think 9 times out of 10, most people have false starts on international expansion for the reason of going too early or underfunding it or not giving it enough attention. And, those three things, so going too early, you haven't got significant product market fit anywhere. And so actually you still need to be focused on product development. The funding pieces, it does take money, particularly to enter somewhere like the US. Talent is more expensive. The tax system is complicated and challenging to navigate. Starting to grow that customer base from zero can sometimes be expensive as well. It's obviously a much bigger geography to service as well. And then, with that, to be successful, you've got to have the bandwidth to double down on that. And often that needs leadership time and investment, and CEOs are being pulled in multiple directions. So are you able to divert your focus from your home territory to your new territory? Is this a time that you've got the bandwidth and capacity to do that? Have you got enough infrastructure to ensure that, if you're turning your sites from the UK to the US, that the UK won't fall over because that may be your only market that's making money, for example. So, you know, it's hard sometimes, I think, for somebody just to say those points to someone. And that would be always why I encourage founders to go out and talk to people who've been on that journey and hear their lessons learned and reflect on what do those lessons learned mean in that founder's particular context. And then that takes us onto that sort of question of more broadly, you know, decision making as a successful CEO. Decision making's hard, right? We get lots of things wrong as leaders of businesses. You have to try to have as much data informing your decisions as possible, even if that is softer data from looking at lessons learned from other similar businesses or other founders. But there's also a piece of instinct, right? It's IQ and EQ. The two have to come together. But I think it's such a fascinating balance. Like my former CEO at Improbable said to me, you got to break eggs to make an omelette. Don't be afraid of pissing people off and, you know, coming in with your screwdriver and making those decisions that may not always be popular and where you're making a bet, and sometimes that bet might be wrong. And I think that's absolutely right. But I also think you have to do it with a healthy dose of humility and learning. And so you've got to balance the two around actually, who do I take counsel from? Where do I inform my decisions from? Be very conscious around that sort of information flow to decision making. And then also, but what is my gut telling me? Because ultimately I'm the person who's accountable for this business day to day.
And how would you think about managing the conflict in the context? Because obviously, if you're making an important decision, we want to go to the US, and maybe not the full leadership team is aligned for, you know, different reasons. You've got full context around the details and the implications. So you need to think about, you know, hiring in the context, and think about, I don't know, customer support. And you think, okay, what is the kind of, you know, engineering setup in the context? How do you go about managing the possible conflict that would materialize as a result?
Yeah, I mean, conflict's hard, particularly in the UK, because you need to create an environment in which conflict happens in the room, not outside of the room. And I think the thing I've seen time and time again with British teams is that the conflict often happens outside the room, where people are either coming one-to-one to CEO or, frankly, bitching and moaning about stuff in the pub. And part of it is you need to create a forum in which people can have healthy debate about something. As a CEO or a leader of the business where you are ultimately accountable for that decision, you need to make sure that you are listening and that you are processing what's being surfaced to you by your leadership team. And I think where I see it go wrong is where people are, you know, actually you're creating a forum for conflict and healthy debate and challenge, but one person isn't listening properly. So that active listening and that humility to openly take on other people's opinions and ideas. And I really suggest that CEOs have coaches to support them in the background on this skill development piece, because I think it's really, really critical. People have to feel heard if you are going to expect them to disagree but commit. Because if people don't feel heard, they will still disagree and they won't truly commit. And I think that is when things go wrong. So building that sort of cultural environment, I'm a huge believer in Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team model. You know, vulnerability-based trust, where you can be open and honest with people, reinforced by healthy conflict, clear commitment, whether you're on board or you weren't originally on board with the idea. That disagree but commit piece is really vital. And then building that culture of accountability, both behaviorally and from a deliverable perspective, and ultimately focusing on the results that the business needs. And I really firmly believe that model has worked for me effectively every time I've rolled it out with teams. But that the conflict layer doesn't work if you don't have trust in the team. And so you've got to make sure that foundation is there. And then look, ultimately as a CEO, or, you know, or a leader accountable for a function or an outcome, it is your job to make a bet, and sometimes the bet will be wrong, and you can't manage by consensus. That is crippling, and we all know that. And so you have to get to a point where you're going, okay, everyone's heard, we're doing it, here's the plan. Now, how do we mitigate the risks that each of you have raised through the process? And then, if you've got a supportive team around you, they'll help you navigate when it goes wrong, and they'll get your back. And if you don't, then you've clearly not got a high-performing team, and you've got bigger problems. Because we've all made bad decisions, whether it's a bad hiring decision or a bad expansion decision. One of the earlier software businesses I was in, expanded into US too early. They didn't put enough leadership oversight there and just hired a couple of big wigs in that market. And it was a massive waste of money and time. But everybody had sat in the original meeting and gone, oh, yeah, this is a good idea. And then everyone was like, well, we told you so. It's like, that's not healthy, is it? Right? Like, did we do everything we could to make this outcome successful? Okay, hopefully we did. If it wasn't successful, what can we learn from it, and what does it mean going forward? The team has to pull together for the business. And so to me, all of this comes back to actually, have you got a high-functioning leadership team? Because if you have, you can have the conflict and the disagreement, and everyone will still get on with delivering against that decision, that outcome. But if you don't have a high-functioning team, it's all going to fall apart. And you might be lucky and it might land, but...
How do you make a high-functioning leadership team?
A lot of time and effort. I mean, it's creating space for it, and almost creating that sort of third eye in the room that can be sort of collectively owned, of going, do we believe we're high functioning? Do we actually feel like we've got each other's backs? Do we feel that we challenge each other effectively? And whether that's facilitated by a third party or one person in the room, often as COO, my job is to sort of observe and mediate a lot. And you have to kind of review your strengths as a team. And I actually think if you do that at least once a year, but ideally more regularly, and you just take a stock check after an away day or a 2-hour meeting and go, how do we feel that we performed? Let's all just score this experience out of 10 and go, oh, it was a 7 for you. Why do you think that was? And somebody might be like, well, because actually I didn't feel like anyone listened to me. Okay, great. That's not a high functioning team right now, is it? But we can fix that. And so it's that conscious effort to try to continually improve, because, where we started, I think I said, you're not always going to be high performance. There are going to be peaks and troughs, but you have to be very conscious of what it is to be high performance, what the right behaviours are, and how that translates into sort of outcomes. And then you need to continually review it. Engineering is such a great function because they do regular retrospectives, and their retrospectives aren't just about what features are we shipping. It's like, how did we feel through that sprint? Did we feel like we had each other's backs? Did we feel like we were crunching? How was our estimation process? But actually, often as cross-functional leadership teams, we don't do that. But when you do, my God, you really it feels uncomfortable, but you really do start to improve.
What drives you personally as a leader?
Is that building high performance teams that deliver shareholder value. I love building businesses, but it's people that build businesses. And personally, I'm so excited by creating that environment and that dynamic where people can shine and they can make the best possible decisions for the business that's going to move us forward. And it's really hard, and it goes to that point that you have to keep working on it. And of course, all the day-to-day sort of nuances that you have to solve as a COO are challenging, and some are more interesting than others. But ultimately, what gets me out of bed is that I want to build a healthy business, but to do that, I've got to build a really strong culture and a really strong sense of team to achieve it. And it's just constantly challenging, and I'm constantly learning, and I'm constantly getting it wrong, and sometimes getting bits right.
It's part of the fun,
right? I really love it. It's really exciting.
Have you got some people over the years that help you, the mentors? Or
yes, I have a whole host of people I've sort of gathered through my career at different levels of seniority. My first finance leader, who I'm sure she won't mind me saying is a few years older than me, and she was my first really senior hire. And I was incredibly daunted. I was a 35-year-old COO hiring somebody who'd been doing this a damn sight longer than me. And actually, we came to build a really strong working relationship, and she has challenged me as much as I've challenged her. And now, she's a really great sounding board for me. I've got a chief people officer who worked with me for a very tough time restructuring a business, where you feel that you've got shared war wounds. And I've got a coach, I've got a former chief legal officer who, again, just has such a different perspective of the world to me. And so, he over-indexes on sort of analytical thinking. And that's really great for me to sort of go, can I phone you up? I'm stuck with this. Do you think this is a good idea? And he'll just reframe it. So, I'm lucky enough to have gathered,
strong
people.
Support network.
Yeah, and, but also people who've reported into me versus people I've reported into. I don't... Everyone brings you a slightly different perspective, and you sort of build your own personal playbook of, I've got this problem, who should I phone up?
Have you got any advice for aspiring COO out there?
Be the glue. Absolutely be the glue. Solve the problems that other people might not want to, or people don't have the bandwidth to. A good COO, going back to the Swiss Army knife analogy, they can roll up their sleeves and kind of tinker around and fix different things that other people might not have had time to fix, or might not have anticipated being a problem that might be about to land. So I would really say focus on that, and then build that network of people you can phone up who can help you, so that you can really not always just have to figure out the problem yourself. You can talk to someone who's solved that problem before, and they can give you a little shortcut.
Have you got any resources that you would recommend for people that want to dive a little bit deeper into these topics?
Yes. Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, I found a really useful book. Going back to that point that, I probably over-index on EQ more than IQ. Other people may be the other way around, but it's a really interesting way of how you think about structuring decision-making. I think that's a really useful tool, because decision-making is kind of everything in a business. Lencioni, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, I've talked about. Fantastic model for building sort of culture and teams, and really doubling down on that sense of accountability. What else? Making of a Manager, really useful for people stepping up into that role. Can't remember the woman's name behind it. The HBR article on 7 profiles of COO, also one that I must have read that article 50 times, because it, just when you're feeling really frustrated because you're not a financial profile of a COO, it just helps you ground yourself and go, it's okay. I don't have to be, a vertical T in all of the different 7 areas. So, I'm a big avid reader, and that's kind of where I take a lot of my reassurance and inspiration from. And I guess finally, The Hard Things About Hard Things by
Classic.
Ben Horowitz.
Classic.
But it was the only book years ago when I was having to make redundancies that talked about making redundancies. And, there are so many books out there about building healthy cultures and the importance of values and building customer success teams. There's not much written out there about what happens when you can't make payroll, what happens when you need to make redundancies, what happens when the cash is running out in the bank, or where you keep setting goals and keep missing them. And that book, was just such a light bulb on moment for me to go, actually, this is kind of really what business is. It's lots of hard problems and lots of stuff going wrong. And that's 80% of our time, and 20% of the time it's going right. And so that book, really made a significant mark on me.
Libby, it was such a special one to record. Thanks very much for taking the time. If people want to stay connected to you, where should they go?
You find me on LinkedIn, Libby Penn. I think I'm the only Libby Penn on there.
Thanks very much again.
Thank you.